Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast. That is, Play the Opinion Potomac Watch Podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch, and I'm talking with Kate Odell and Bill McGurn. I think that there's an underlying belief here, Bill, and I want to just talk briefly about this exchange of tweets between Neil Ferguson, who is the historian of the Cold War and Kissinger's biographer, and J.D. Vance. And Ferguson issued a tweet that was critical of the president's statements on Ukraine. And J.D. Vance replied with what I think is fair to say was a vitriolic attack on Ferguson, both ad hominem and also an attempt to justify the administration's position and support what Trump's view is. I'm not going to read it. It's a very long tweet. You can find it online if you look at J.D. Vance's account. But the message I come away from this with Vance thinks is Ukraine lost. They can't win. We, the United States, do not want to continue to support Ukraine because we think it has lost, and we think doing so is not in the American interest. And it's better for the American interest to do a deal with Russia, even if it is bad for Ukraine. And we're going to do it, and you got to accept it. That's the message I think they're sending, Bill.
I think it is. I think it's actually worse than that.
I sugarcoated it, Bill. Is that?
You're salty. You're a switchball. I think the idea is that Ukraine doesn't matter to the U.S., and that's really dangerous. And they think that if it really does matter to Europe and is vital, as people like us say, the Europeans will step up and fill the gap. Go back to history. Dean Atkinson said South Korea is not in our sphere of interest,
Mm-hmm.
Then
remember that.
War breaks out on the peninsula and American troops are sent in. April Glaspie, like 40 years later, says the same thing about Iraq. And what do you know? Saddam invades Kuwait. So this idea that we're not affected by this, I think is silly. And again, what I really can't understand, I can understand people who don't want to be in a war, even isolationists, as much as I disagree. I can't understand the conservative hostility to a victim country, a country that's been invaded. Throughout history, the Republicans were the ones that rallied to these nations that were invaded by their communist aggressor neighbors and so forth. I just can't understand why people hate Ukraine so much.
Well, and I think that's part of the reason that Trump is so critical and cutting about Ukraine and essentially, calls it a dictatorship. He wants elections there, even though Winston Churchill didn't have an election and the British didn't have an election during World War II. And it's part of the Ukrainian constitution not to have it. But he wants to stigmatize Ukraine and make the American public, or a large part of the public, think they actually don't deserve victim status. They are co-belligerents who are equally at fault for this war. Kate, I'm going to give you the last word. And the question I want, this looks like it's heading for a quite rapid settlement of some kind. And I guess the question is, what happens if Ukraine says no?
Well, I think that's an increasing risk because I think Donald Trump kind of antagonizing Zelensky this way will rally the Ukrainians around Zelensky to the extent they were skeptical of him. His rhetoric here is probably making it harder for Ukraine to accept a deal than it otherwise would be. And I agree that it was imprudent of him to say Trump is living in a disinformation space, even if there is a lot of reason to agree with that at this point, because Trump always escalates and there's nothing to be had there. But yes, there is also a risk here that there's no deal to be had if Putin won't tolerate even getting all of these concessions and ask for more, including, not allowing Ukraine to have a substantial military. I think that's a possibility at this point. But overall, I think, we're talking about why is there so much disdain on elements of the right for Ukraine. I think some of that is a function of political polarization, and the Biden family association with Ukraine has taken on an outsized significance in how Americans think about that country's politics. And so I think that the questions here, though, I think Americans do understand that keeping Putin off the NATO border is fundamentally in our interest, whether Ukraine is as much of a democratic society as we would like it to be or not. So I'm hopeful here that there's still an opportunity to influence Trump in constructive directions, because he does say he wants to restore American standing in the world and wants the U.S. to be powerful. And just where he's heading on Ukraine is not going to produce that outcome, and it's going to be a headache for him and whoever follows him for years to come.
Yeah, and we can hope that, in fact, he is willing to insist on terms that will allow Ukraine to survive, essentially, as a country and to be able to deter Vladimir Putin in the future or a successor to Putin. All right, we're going to leave it here for today. We will be back every day as we are on Potomac Watch, and I want to thank everybody for listening, and thanks to Bill and Kate.